The Doctrines of Discovery are well known as being a justification to dispossess native peoples of their lands throughout history. But that's a rather limited understanding of the Doctrines of Discovery. They weren't just an excuse to steal land. The Doctrines of Discovery developed into an entire protocol. It was like an entire protocol between European powers. It formed the genesis of international law itself. So if you imagine the whole world as one big giant playground, and the Doctrines of Discovery are a game that is going to be played in this playground. At the start of the game, there's only one kid in the playground, and that's Portugal. And Portugal has a good time by himself initially. But then another kid comes along, Spain. The two start fighting with each other. And the first thing that kids do when they're fighting with each other and they can't work it out is to go run to the nearest responsible adult. In this case, the responsible adult was the Pope. The Pope's solution was to divide the playground into two different spheres, a Spanish sphere and the Portuguese sphere. Now these are known, and still even today you can see the legacy of this, because we think of America as being in the West. We think of the Middle East and the Far East, those regions. This all comes from this division that the Pope did. So in this diagram here, in this purple dotted line, is where the Pope drew that initial line. A few years after that, Spain and Portugal mutually agreed to shift this line slightly. And this is just because of the way the wind works in the Atlantic Ocean, because if you want to go from Europe down around the bottom of Africa here, it's actually easier if you go to South America first and then slingshot off that, because otherwise if you try to follow the coast down Africa, you get stuck in the doldrums down here and you can't get around. It's actually faster to sail towards America first. Spain and Portugal mutually agreed to shift that line a little bit to the west. So what happened then is the Spanish colonized much of the Americas, and they started also exploring the Pacific Ocean, which was in their half of the world. They eventually came around to the other side and started coming into the Portuguese sphere. So they were entering into the Spice Islands or the Molucca Islands here. And then that's when more conflicts started, because Spain said, well, this is on our side because we travelled from the west. So this started a new conflict between the Spanish and the Portuguese. So they had to make a new deal. So they made this second treaty, the Treaty of Zaragoza. And the Treaty of Zaragoza gave Portugal the Molucca Islands here, particularly the Banda Islands, which are just north of Australia. Now the line of the Treaty of Zaragoza was so far away from the known parts of the world that it is hard to measure precisely. I think that this diagram here doesn't quite have it in the right spot. Another thing to note about the Treaty of Zaragoza is that it cuts through the continental landmass of Australia, and this has had quite a big effect on the colonisation of Australia. And this is why I think it's a crucial background to understanding how Australia was colonised, because it definitely had an effect. So moving along in history, in the history of the Age of Discovery, later on it was not just Spain and Portugal who were playing this game. The French, the British, the Dutch and others also joined in. Now, much like some children playing in a playground and making up their own rules as they go, When the more players join the game, then the rules get changed slightly. Now, in the Doctrines of Discovery, some of these rules were formalised through treaties. Others were just customary, just mutual understandings between the players themselves. Now, to get a good introduction on what these rules were, I will show you Robert J. Miller's 10 Elements of the Doctrines of Discovery, because I think they're a good starting point. So the 10 Elements by Robert J. Miller are written here. Now in this video I'm going to concentrate on number 3, 4 and 8. And they are, number 3 is first discovery, number 4 is actual occupation and possession, and 8 is contiguity. Now these principles apply during the first discovery phase of the colonization of a place. Around 1600, the Dutch came in and took a lot of the previously Portuguese settlements and colonies in the Spice Islands area. So a lot of these places that used to be Portuguese are now Dutch, and they're now held by the Dutch East Indies Company. One of the native kingdoms in the Spice Islands area is the Sultanate of Tidor. The Dutch Indies Company considered that the Sultanate of Tidor had sovereignty, or at least sovereignty over parts of West Papua. And as the Dutch East Indies Company did treaties with the Sultanate of Tidor, then the East Indies Company considered that they also in turn have some kind of jurisdiction over West Papua. Now I'm going to talk about what I think are some of the key voyages in the so-called discovery of Australia. I'm going to talk about these 4 voyages here. So in 1606, the Dutch East Indies were just moving into the Portuguese parts of the Spice Islands. At the same time, the Spanish and the Portuguese were in an alliance together. The Spanish sent an expedition of discovery into the Pacific, and the captain of this was actually a Portuguese fella named Quiros. This map here shows his course. Now, the Kiwis Expedition had 3 ships. There were 2 main ships and like a dinghy thing that goes in between them. So the expedition left this place here called Callao. So the Kiwis Expedition left South America from this place Callao and went across the Pacific until they landed on this island here, and this island is now what's in Vanuatu. This is a map that was drawn by one of the people on the expedition. We've got a bay here, and this bay was called the Bay of St. Philip and St. James. There is this little island on the side here, and deep inside the bay there are a bunch of rivers. Quiros falsely believed that he'd discovered a huge great southern mythical continent, and he called it La Australia del Espiritu Santo. The bay itself he called the Bay of St. Philip and St. James. Quiros in his writings describes the bay as having 2 rivers inside, one of those rivers being big enough to accommodate ships. He called the rivers the River Jordan and the River Salvador. Quiros also described the natives as having huts with palm frond leaved roofs, with fruit trees. They had pigs, and that it was a very large country. The expedition set up a small settlement inside this bay. They ended up in conflict with the natives and things really went downhill. But to keep a long story short, we'll just say Quiros was locked up in his cabin in the ship, and the ship took off went back to Acapulco. And they left the second ship and the tender, the dinghy behind. The second ship was captained by Taurus. Taurus stayed in this bay for a total of 50 days. Remember this number because I'll come back to that later. But yeah, the total time that this second ship was in the bay of St. Philip and St. James was 50 days. After the 50 days, they left and they went to Manila. But the interesting thing is the way that they went to Manila. They actually travelled westward and they ended up passing south of New Guinea, and they went in between New Guinea and what's now Australia. They had passed through the Torres Strait, and this is why the Torres Strait has that name, Taurus, because Taurus was the captain of this ship. Now, I don't think many people realised that he'd gone through the passage, and the journals and the documents for this voyage ended up sitting gathering dust inside Spanish naval archives for a long time. So it wasn't really wide knowledge that this strait between New Guinea and what's now Australia was known about. Meanwhile, Quiros went back to Europe, and he really wanted to go and explore this land again because he really believed that he'd stumbled on a great land. He started writing a series of letters which are known as memorials to the Spanish king. Now, as he is trying to convince the Spanish king of the worthiness of going off on another voyage, he exaggerates a bit. Well, he exaggerates a lot, and he makes out that the land is a lot bigger and a lot richer than it actually is. A lot of these letters somehow get leaked and translated into different languages and are published all around Europe. Quiros's exaggerated accounts of this island become conflated with the mythical southern continent. In the mind of many Europeans, this small island in Vanuatu becomes a much huger thing than it actually is. Now, one of the very first letters that Quiros wrote to the king was one that was not published widely in Europe, but recently come to light. The State Library of New South Wales recently bought a copy of it, and I've just shown you a small part here because this is really interesting. It says here, in the happy memory of Your Majesty and for the House of Austria, the name La Australia del Espíritu Santo is being given to this new name. So note that it's La Australia. It's named after Austria. Now, the word Austria in Spanish is basically the name for the Habsburgs because the king of Spain at the time was a Habsburg. So Quiros, who gave La Australia del Espíritu Santo its name, stated early on that the name was after Austria. It wasn't to do with the southern continent. But later on, he was a bit inconsistent with his naming and he called it other things like Australia Incognita. Quiros's voyage was in 1606, and now we're moving on to 1642, Abel Tasman's voyage. This map here shows his voyage from Mauritius, but he actually started in Batavia here, went to Mauritius, and then he dropped down to the south and went along here until he hit the coast of Van Diemen's Land. He then tucked under the bottom of Van Diemen's Land, went a bit further, and then he charted some of the west coast of New Zealand. Then he headed up towards, I think this is Fiji up here, and up around here, around the top of New Guinea, back through the Spice Islands, back to Batavia. So I just want to show you this map here of the bottom of Tasmania that Abel Tasman made. He passes these two rocks here. There's the Pedra Branca and Verthont als en Plumpenturen. So it looks, that says, looks like a big tower, I think. Then he passes this place called Borel's Island, and he goes into, and according to his journal, he's riding along here and he sees a nice beach and he wants to go in to explore. When he goes into the beach, a big storm comes and he runs out to sea because he's scared of getting hit by winds and being smashed into the coast. He goes so far out to sea that he can't see the land anymore. When he comes back, he passes this point here that he has on his map, Tasman's Island, and here the South Cape. He passes them and then he makes an anchor in Fredericks Henry Bay. At the end of a 4-day stay in Fredericks Henry Bay, Tasman's carpenter plants a prince's flag in an active possession of Van Diemen's Land. Now moving on back here to Storm Bay. Now in real life, this bay here has a very big opening in it to this big system of harbours. If you sail into this bay here, you can get into Hobart, but by Tasman's map it doesn't really look possible. So I hypothesized that maybe Tasman saw this very nice harbour here and he wanted to keep it a secret, so he made up this story about getting blown out in a storm. So to give him an excuse to hide this nice harbour from his map, from potential competitors. So it just looks like a continuous bay. Now here is another map that he drew. This is one single map and there's different sections of coastline. Now in between this gap here is the harbour, but you can't tell that there's a big harbour in this little tiny gap here. I'll just overlay these sections on Google Earth and show you where I think they actually are. So you see here, there is a huge section that's missing from the map. Now another thing to note here is that when Tasman was going around the coast, he was measuring his coordinates as he went. Now as he had gone really a long way from a known point from Mauritius, his longitudes were probably had a lot of error in them. Now the accuracy of Tasman's longitudes depends a lot on just guesswork and also using hourglass timers, like sand through the hourglass timers that you actually have to pick up and turn around every hour or something. So he was measuring his longitude from a long way, so his absolute longitudes were probably a bit out, but his relative longitudes might have been okay. So he's then travelled from Tasmania, or Van Diemen's Land, onto New Zealand. And in New Zealand he has also marked his longitudes. I'll tell you why that's important later. The next voyage I want to talk about is James Cook's. Now, setting the scene for Cook's 1770 voyage, I would like to put on the Royal Society hat and look at the planning of this voyage from the perspective of the British at the time. Now, keeping in mind, Cook's voyage was in 1770. Not long before that, the British occupied Manila from 1762 to 1764. During this occupation, they obtained a lot of naval documents. These documents were analysed and translated by Alexander Dalrymple. When Dalrymple was going through these documents, he found the testimony of Taurus. Now, as you recall from earlier in this video, Taurus was part of that Quiros' voyage from Espiritu Santo, and he went through the Torres Strait up to Manila. Dalrymple's discovery of this Torres Strait through the documents is actually very significant strategically for the British. And it's important strategically because of one of these principles of the Doctrines of Discovery called contiguity. Now I'm just going to show you some contemporary maps from before Cook's voyage just to show you what a general understanding of the world was like at the time. So here is a map that I've already shown which shows Abel Tasman's voyage, and this map is from 1726. So as you can see here, this map has New Guinea and New Holland joined together. Also out here in the Pacific Ocean this is Espiritu Santo. So this is Quiros' land as well. And then we have Van Diemen's Land at the bottom. Now as you can see from this, it's possible that all of these lands are all connected to each other. Here is another map. This is by the French cartographer Bellin. Now Bellin has Espiritu Santo stuck on the side of New Holland. You can see here is the River Jordan and the River Salvador. These are the two rivers that Quiros named. And this land is being placed about where Cooktown is now at latitude of 15 degrees. Now Quiros himself placed Espiritu Santo at 15 degrees in 10 minutes. Now here is another chart by Alexander Dalrymple from his book that he published in 1770, and this was while Cook was already out on his voyage. Now as you can see here, we have New Holland over here. We have Terra del Espiritu Santos or Manicola here. So Dalrymple's put Espiritu Santo pretty much in its correct spot out in the Pacific. And Dalrymple has also marked here Taurus's track from Espiritu Santo through the Torres Strait. Now I'm going to say why the discovery of the Torres Strait in these documents was so important strategically, and it's to do with the doctrines of discovery and to do with the rules of the game that they play. Now perhaps it was a common assumption at the time that Papua, New Holland and Van Diemen's Land was one contiguous landmass. Now if that's the case, then the Dutch pretty much have that single landmass stitched up because they have treaties with kingdoms in Papua. They have charted a lot of the coast of New Holland, and Tasman has placed a flag and made a possession claim on Van Diemen's Land. Now out of these three different ways of claiming a territory, the treaty is the most solid. But with the discovery of the Torres Strait, it means that the treaty only applies to a small amount of land of that entire landmass that New Holland is trying to claim. So in other words, New Holland and Van Diemen's Land, they don't have any treaty there, so it makes that land a little bit more up for grabs. In the discovery doctrines, it's not good enough to just be the first discoverer and just plant a flag. You need to settle it, or you need to make a treaty with the inhabitants to really solidify your claim over a territory. So this is something that the British can exploit. Another thing that the British may be looking to exploit here is the Treaty of Zaragoza. Now, the Dutch are successors to the Portuguese, and the Portuguese in the Spice Islands, their boundary was demarcated by the Treaty of Zaragoza. That might explain why the Dutch never really bothered charting the east coast of New Holland, because they just saw it as outside of their zone. So this is another thing. The extreme east coast of New Holland may be up for grabs simply because it lies in a different sphere of the world as the Dutch claim in the Spice Islands. Now, the very most southeast claim of the Dutch was during Tasman's expedition in Van Diemen's Land. Now, he placed a flag on the east coast of Van Diemen's Land. So, potentially, any land that lies on New Holland that is to the east of that flag may be up for grabs also. That is probably the safest place for the British to claim. New Zealand definitely lies well inside the Spanish lake, and if Tasman has never claimed possession of it and nobody's done any treaties with the Maori, then perhaps it can also be considered up for grabs by the British. Now let's put our Royal Society thinking cap on here. If we want to claim parts of New Holland that lie to the east of Tasman's Prince's flag, how can we go about doing that? Well, the way to do that is actually fairly simple. I'll just show you this chart here, and this chart is from Tasman. On the left here it shows the coordinates that he's given, the longitudinal coordinates that he's given for the Prince's flag that he's left near Fredericks Henry Bay. Tasman then headed westwards towards New Zealand, and he landed in a bay which he called Murderous Bay, and he also left coordinates there. Now remembering here, Tasman travelled all the way from Mauritius, so his absolute longitude coordinates are probably a bit out, but his relative coordinates might be okay. So what we can do is take the longitude of his Prince's flag and the longitude of Murderers Bay and find the difference between it. And now we know the longitudinal distance from Murderers Bay to the easternmost claim of the Dutch. So all we need to do as potential British discoverers is find Murderers Bay, then head west for exactly 23 degrees and 46 minutes. Once we've done that, we know we have reached the same longitude as Tasman's Prince's flag. Anywhere that lies east of that flag is potentially up for grabs. Keeping our Royal Society thinking caps on, there is one more potential aspect that we can exploit in our claiming of New Holland as British territory. Now, as we know, the Torres Strait lies and separates Papua and New Holland. There is a potential that New Holland itself was not discovered by the Dutch, but actually discovered by Quiros in 1606. Now, when Quiros did his voyage to Espiritu Santo, he did claim that land in the right of the Spanish crown and in the right, I think, of the right of the Holy Ghost and of the Catholic Church. So if that's the case, that Espiritu Santo actually lies on the east coast of New Holland, as is depicted in some charts, then that means that the Spanish actually discovered New Holland and the Dutch have not. So that makes the job of the British to usurp Dutch claims over New Holland a bit easier. because all they would have to do is usurp the Spanish claim instead. And I don't think the Spanish are going to really care, as they're not really in the picture in that area anymore. So to exploit this, we would like to perhaps send a voyage up the east coast of New Holland and look around about 15 degrees south to see if we can find that land that was discovered by Quiros. And while we are searching for this land of Quiros, keeping in mind his description of the land as being a bay with 2 rivers inside. So now that we've got a basic strategy of how to usurp the Dutch claim over New Holland, it's time to put things into action. Now I'm going to follow through Cook's voyage step by step and show you how little things that he's done indicate that this is the exact strategy that the British were following in this voyage. So firstly, Cook's voyage goes to Tahiti and observes the transit of Venus as planned. The next part of Cook's instructions was to drop down to 40 degrees south and then head west. The reason for 40 degrees south is because there was a Spanish explorer named Juan Fernandez, and in 1574 he left from Chile and he headed out into the Pacific at 40 degrees south, and he claimed that he discovered a great southern land. So the reason why Cook has left from Tahiti and dropped down to 40 degrees is probably because Dalrymple thought that perhaps there was a great southern land down there. Another reason is that Abel Tasman has discovered New Zealand, but he's only charted a part of the western coast of New Zealand. So New Zealand could be an absolutely huge land for all they know. After he eventually hits New Zealand, he does a figure of 8 charting the coastline of New Zealand in its entirety. So during Cook's expedition around New Zealand, he identifies Tasman's Murderer's Bay. Right next to Murderer's Bay is a cape, and Cook names this cape Cape Farewell. Cook uses Cape Farewell as his departure point from New Zealand. The reason he is doing this is because he's employing this strategy that I outlined before to count backwards in longitude so he can find where Tasman has left the Prince's flag. While Cook is transiting across the Tasman Sea, he reckons his longitude relative to Cape Farewell. On the 18th of April 1770, he writes in his journal, "At noon our latitude by observation was 38 degrees 45 minutes south, longitude from Cape Farewell 23 degrees and 43 minutes west. By our longitude we are a degree to the westward of the east side of Van Diemen's Land, according to Tasman, the first discoverers, longitude of it, who could not err much in so short a run as from this land to New Zealand, and by our latitude we could not be above 50 or 55 leagues to the northward of this place where he took his departure from." So as you can see from this strategy that is outlined here, the calculated difference between the Prince's Flag and Murderer's Bay, according to Tasman, is 23 degrees and 46 minutes. In Cook's journal on this day, the difference is 23 degrees 43 minutes. And Cook also says that he thinks he is a degree westward of the east side of Van Diemen's Land. So in other words, on the 18th of April, Cook thinks he's almost exactly north of the location of the Prince's flag. He also thinks he is already above Van Diemen's Land and he has already gone across it by 1 degree. So if Cook is expecting to hit the east coast of New Holland, it should probably have already happened, or it should happen any moment now. On the next day, Cook sights land at what's called Point Hicks. Now this place has been a bit of a mystery because the location that Cook gives for Point Hicks actually lies in the middle of the ocean. I'll show here on this map here of Google Earth. Now this brown line here is the coastline as charted by Cook. This point here is the coordinates that Cook has given for the first place that he sighted land. Obviously he can't have sighted land there because it is in the middle of the ocean. Now this has been a bit of a mystery as to why this has been placed on the map for a while, but I think I know what the reason for putting this point on 38 degrees is. I think that Cook's real secret instructions was to actually chart the east coast of New Holland from the northern extremity in the Torres Strait down to 38 degrees south. Why 38 degrees south? Well, it gives a little bit of a space from Tasman's discovery. It's not too far south that it doesn't look out of the way for Cook's cover story. Now remembering Cook's cover story is that he's heading for Batavia, so he should be aiming a little bit more north. I think 38 degrees south is kind of a good compromise. Now the problem is when Cook actually hits 38 degrees south, he is expecting a coastline that is running roughly north-south, but instead he finds a coastline that is running east-west. And not only that, but the 38 degrees south line runs just south of this coastline that is running east-west. So it's actually impossible for him at this stage to start charting the land at 38 degrees south. Now his alternative is he could keep heading west until he does hit land, but at this stage he is in uncharted territory. He can't be sure that he actually will hit land. And anyway, he is supposed to be heading up the east coast. If he keeps heading west, he may end up tracking along the south part of New Holland, which isn't what he wants. So his instructions really don't fit the coastline. So instead of disobeying his instructions, he simply changes the coastline on his map. Another bit of circumstantial evidence of this is the track that he's taken across from New Zealand. As you can see here, he leaves Cape Farewell, he heads north. He heads so far north that he ends up above, well, further north than 38 degrees south. So you would expect that this wouldn't really be an issue if he really was just heading for Batavia, but no, he wants to hit the New Holland coast at 38 degrees, so he makes a correction back down south just to make sure he hits that sweet spot on the coast. So Cook has successfully reached the east coast of New Holland and starts heading northwards. He goes past a lot of nice bays and harbours like Bateman's Bay and I think that's Jervis Bay. I don't really know the New South Wales coast that well. Now remember what I said before, that the British might want to make claims of places that are east of Abel Tasman's Prince's flag. Well, would you have a look at this? The very moment that Cook crosses this line, he goes ashore pretty much straight away at Bully. Now Bully lies at 150 degrees and 55 minutes. This is what Cook has calculated the longitude of Tasman's Prince's Flag to be. He literally goes to shore as soon as he's reached this point to make a claim. The reason is it's a part of this game of discovery. He wants to put a marker on the southmost possible point it's like a border marker to mark the southernmost point of the potential British claim. But he doesn't get to go to shore because I think the surf is bad or the wind or something. So he continues up the coastline and goes into Botany Bay. Now, if you want to know why he didn't go into Port Jackson, well, because Port Jackson is further north of that, and Cook probably wanted to go to the most southern part possible. Cook stayed in Botany Bay for 5 days. This is exactly 1 day more than what Abel Tasman stayed in Fredericks Henry Bay in Tasmania. This is a pattern that I've seen, and I'll show you more examples of this later. Cook continues to head up the east coast of New Holland. He doesn't land again until the town of 1770. At that point, the coast has turned back to the west, and it's eventually going to cross that Tasman Prince's Flag line again. So in order to put a marker, if you like, a northern marker of this potential British claimed territory, he lands in the town of 1770, or which he calls Bustard Bay. Now the 2 landings that he's made so far are on the mainland. Once he crosses back over to the west side of the Prince's Flag, he starts landing on islands. His first landing is in Thirsty Sound, which is just over the other side of the Prince's Flag line. Cook keeps heading up the coast, and his next landing is at Palm Island, or one of the islands in the Palm Island group, and he goes and gets some coconuts. His next landing after that is actually a mainland landing in Trinity Bay, and the next landing after that was the landing in Cooktown. Now, I think that both of these landings were because Cook thought they were, or they might be, the Bay of St. Philip and St. James as discovered by Quiros, and I'll just show you why. So these 2 landings are both getting a bit close to 15 degrees south, which is the latitude that Quiros gave for Espiritu Santo. The first landing is here in Yarrabah, and this is near Cairns. So I'll just show you on Google Earth here what this looks like. So Cook would have approached from the south here. This little bay here, and there's this little island here called Fitzroy Island. So he would have seen this island, and he would have zoomed in here into this bay. This is Cairns here. Now I just want to show you here this map from Taurus's Voyage, which shows Espiritu Santo, and I think Cook probably had seen this. Now, as you can see, there's a little island here, and this is the general shape of the bay. Now, this bay that Yarrabah sits in, it would resemble this, especially from the direction that Cook has approached. Now, when Cook came into this bay, the first thing he did was to go right into the deep part of the deep nook of the bay and see if there was a river there. There was no rivers there, so I think he figured out pretty fast that this isn't Espiritu Santo. But I think the reason he went in there is because he was going to see if he could find these 2 rivers. He is looking for a bay with 2 rivers that lies at about 15 degrees south. Cook's next landing along the Queensland coast was in the Endeavour River next to Cooktown. Now, you've probably heard the story about this. The Endeavour hit a reef, sustained a lot of damage, and the ship was saved and brought into the Endeavour River. And there, Cook's party stayed and fixed the boat. I just want to read a part of a journal entry on Monday the 11th of June 1770. My intention was to stretch off all night, as well to avoid the danger we saw ahead as to see if any islands lay in the offing, especially as we now begun to draw near the latitude of those discovered by Quiros, which some geographers, for what reason I know not, have thought proper to tack to this land. So later on this exact same day is when Cook hits the reef. It's a pretty big coincidence that Cook has realised he's in the similar latitude to Quiros' discovery, and on the exact same day he hits the reef. So on the 11th of June, Cook hits the reef. On the 12th of June, he gets the ship off the reef. The next day, he manages to plug the leak in the ship, and on the day after that, the ship arrives in a bay. Here is a bay with two rivers. This matches Quiros' description of Espiritu Santo. Cook first landed near the Annan River here. This is on the south side of the bay. That was found to be too shallow, so they went around into the Endeavour River, which was a bit deeper. The town of Cooktown lies in between these two rivers. This line here is 15 degrees 10 minutes south, and that is the exact latitude that Quiros gave for Espiritu Santo. Quiros' latitude of 15 degrees 10 minutes is actually exactly spot on. He's measured that very well. This is where the Endeavour River is in relation to this latitude. And down here is Trinity Bay, that first landing that Cook had in relation to the line. They're fairly close. Now, if you calculate the amount of time that Cook was in the actual bay itself, he arrived in the bay on the 14th of June 1770, and he left on the 4th of August 1770. Now, that is a total of 51 days. So Cook has stayed in this bay exactly 1 day longer than Taurus stayed in Espiritu Santo. I think Cook genuinely believes that he is in the Bay of St. Philip and St. James, and that's why he stayed there for 51 days. There are two rivers in this bay, and it is at about the right latitude. 51 days is an awfully long time to be repairing the ship. If you read the journal of his stay in the bay, towards the end of it, there's not really much happening. On the last day before Cook leaves, he writes in his journal, "In the PM, having pretty moderate weather, I ordered the coasting anchor and cable to be laid without the bar, to be ready to warp out by, that we might not lose the least opportunity that might offer. For laying in port spends time to no purpose, consumes our provisions, of which we are very short in many articles, and we have yet a long passage to make to the East Indies through an unknown and perhaps dangerous sea. These circumstances considered make me very anxious of getting to sea." This is a kind of odd thing to say. You would think the reason for leaving is, yes, we've finally got the ship ready and the weather is good, but he's giving the reason for leaving as that they're running out of supplies. It sounds as if he's been having a bit of a holiday there and he's just running out of food. So out of Cooktown, it's not very far to the tip of Cape York, which Cook reaches and lands on Possession Island. It is at Possession Island that he makes the following declaration: "Having satisfied myself of the great probability of a passage, through which I intend going with the ship, and therefore may land no more upon this eastern coast of New Holland, and on the western side I can make no new discovery, the honour of which belongs to the Dutch navigators, but the eastern coast from the latitude of 38 degrees south down to this place, I am confident was never seen or visited by any European before us, and notwithstanding I had in the name of His Majesty taken possession of several places upon this coast, I now once more hoisted English colours, and in the name of His Majesty King George III took possession of the whole eastern coast from the above latitude down to this place, by the name of New Wales." So you can see here why it was necessary to put Point Hicks on the map, because Point Hicks lies at exactly 38 degrees south. So he's just claimed possession of the coastline that he has charted. Now, some people think that this proclamation was fabricated later on back in England. There is a part of this proclamation here that makes me think that's not the case, and that Cook really did make this at the time. It's because in this proclamation, Cook acknowledges the honour of the Dutch navigators to have discoveries of the remainder part of New Holland. I think if this proclamation was fabricated back in London, they would never have included that in there. So let's imagine now that Cook has returned to England. Cook goes in to meet with the Brains Trust at the Royal Society to be debriefed on his voyage. He is going to tell them how he fudged the map around Point Hicks, around the south part of New Holland. He's also going to tell them that the coastline around Point Hicks actually runs in a west-east direction. So I've taken a chart here from 1787, which is after Cook's second voyage, and I have modified it slightly so that it aligns with the known situation upon Cook's return on his first voyage. So I've backdated the chart from 1787 to 1770 upon Cook's return. So I've removed up here Vanuatu, or the New Hebrides, and I've removed New Caledonia and Norfolk Island because they were not discovered at this time. I have also shifted Van Diemen's Land slightly to the east. Now this is because when Cook on his first voyage sailed from New Zealand to New Holland, on the 18th of April 1770, he made a remark in his journal that he believed that he was 1 degree to the west of the east coast of Van Diemen's Land. So in other words, Van Diemen's Land is shifted like so. And Cook is on the 18th of April at this red X here. So is Van Diemen's Land joined up like I have depicted on this map here, or is there a strait in between? Now verifying this and knowing for sure whether there is a strait would be very extremely valuable information for the British. The implications of the strait I will now explain. The Dutch have a treaty with the Sultanates in West Papua. That treaty has now been separated from New Holland because of the existence and discovery of the Torres Strait. Abel Tasman made his formal possession claim on Van Diemen's Land down here. If there is a strait that lies between Van Diemen's Land and New Holland, what it means is that the Dutch have never formally claimed possession of this big landmass in the middle of New Holland. For the British to have knowledge of the existence of this strait, or the Bass Strait, would be absolutely huge, because it means that potentially the entirety of New Holland is up for grabs. So I think the British would want to confirm this as an absolute matter of priority. They would also want to do so in a way that is very discreet and that does not let on to their competitors what they are doing. James Cook is a bit of a celebrity, so if you want to do things discreetly, he's probably not the best person to send. Somebody a bit more low-key, maybe with a French-sounding name, might be better suited. So on Cook's second voyage, 2 ships were sent out, the Resolution and the Adventurer. Cook captained the Resolution and Furneaux captained the Adventure. Each ship had its own dedicated astronomer to accurately measure longitude. The voyage in total carried 4 chronometers. I'm presuming that Furneaux's ship, the Adventurer, would have had at least 1 chronometer. Cook's second voyage started off by heading down to the southern tip of Africa. Then they started to make their way around Antarctica in a clockwise direction. It wasn't long before Furneaux's ship split off because it was allegedly lost in the fog. Furneaux's ship, the Adventurer, branched off and went up to Van Diemen's Land, where he began his secret mission. Now I infer that his secret mission was the following. Firstly, he wanted to locate Fredericks Henry Bay. Fredericks Henry Bay is the bay that Tasman stayed in his 1642 voyage. Tasman stayed in this bay for 4 days and he planted a flag of possession nearby. Furneaux is to land in this bay and to draw some very accurate drawings of the bay to prove that he was there. As soon as he is confirmed and proven that he's in Fredericks Henry Bay, he wants to head up into the Bass Strait and to confirm the existence or non-existence of it. He may also want to touch base with discoveries of Cook on the New Holland mainland so that he can accurately position the location of Van Diemen's Land in relation to New Holland. He should then sail to the rendezvous point for the second voyage in New Zealand. Now the cover story for all of this is that Furneaux is actually sitting in Fredericks Henry Bay for 5 days. 5 days, of course, being Tasman's 4-day stay plus 1, because you have to outdo your competitor. Now, one problem with this, there's only one chart of Van Diemen's Land, and that's by Tasman. And as I've explained before, there is a big mistake on this chart. Storm Bay here is actually not a smooth crescent bay like this. It is actually an opening to a big system of harbours. Furneaux is using this chart to try to navigate into Fredericks Henry Bay. Because he is using a chart with such a big mistake in it, he ends up going into the wrong bay. Now Furneaux thinks he is in Fredericks Henry Bay, which is actually up here. So to get into Fredericks Henry Bay, you have to go around this point, along a bit of a peninsula, and then tuck in the back here in this bay. But Furneaux is actually over here. He's gone around this point here, along this peninsula, and tucked into this other bay here. He's in completely the wrong bay. I think he was probably there just long enough to get a good drawing of the area. After that, he's taken off like a bat out of hell and hasn't really paid much attention to the coast. Now I think that Furneaux may have actually gone around in a clockwise direction, so up the west coast of Van Diemen's Land. He's come along the top of Van Diemen's Land and come out through this little channel here. Then he's dropped down south here until he reaches St. Patrick's Head. Now St. Patrick's Head was described by Tasman. So now that he's made contact with the northern part of Tasman's charts and accounts, all he has to do is fill in this gap here, which he never visited, with Tasman's chart. Furneaux's then headed north and discovered the Furneaux Islands. In Furneaux's journal, he is adamant that there is no Bass Strait. He is absolutely positive that there is no strait between Van Diemen's Land and New Holland. Of course he's going to say that because he wants to keep the existence of this strait a top secret. So after Furneaux discovered the Bass Strait, he's headed off to New Zealand. Furneaux arrives in New Zealand pretty close to Cape Farewell. He gives a longitudinal offset from Adventure Bay as being 24 degrees. So he has used a chronometer here to calculate the difference in longitude between Adventure Bay and Cape Farewell, or Tasman's Murderer's Bay. This is a mission accomplished. Here is the chart that Furneaux made from his voyage. I've overlaid it onto Google Earth here, and I've lined up the latitudes and longitudes and not the coastline. The section down south here from the southwest cape to where he's marked Adventure Bay actually lines up very well with the coast. But further east is a different story. The entire east coast of Van Diemen's Land is a bit off. So now at this stage, the British are aware of the strait in between Van Diemen's Land and New Holland. The French might also be aware of the existence of this strait. The next thing that will need to be done here is another expedition to land on New Holland proper and claim it on behalf of the British. And this happens later in 1788 with the arrival of the First Fleet. With the arrival of the First Fleet and the settlement and claim of the main part of New Holland, we're going to enter into a new phase in the discovery of Australia. So that's a good place to end the video, with the start of this new phase of the movement of the British frontier across New Holland.